Last topic, and then we'll take some questions. So we went through 6 tools so far. The 7th tool for understanding how the brain works is language. Words matter. And remember the BDMA? Is that a new designer drug? What's the BDMA? Thank you. The brain disease model of addiction. Everyone here is going to know so much more about that than you did when you started. So words matter. So if I say addiction's a brain disease, Art could come back and say, but Kai, Nature is one of the top journals in science. Somebody said substance abuse cannot be divorced from its social, psychological, cultural, political, legal, and environmental context. It's not simply brain malfunction. That's true. I agree with that, right? So if I say addiction is just a brain disease, then I've created a linguistic problem. If I say the only coherent way to treat addiction is with medication, I've created a problem. Because the brain is this very complicated organ. So now addiction is also a molecular problem because we're made of molecules, right? And it's a cellular problem because we're made of cells. But are those levels of understanding that reduce suffering, are they helpful? Are they humane? And is it humane if you talk about addiction as a spiritual problem or a moral problem? Is that helpful? Is it humane? I'm not going to get into whether it's right. Is it helpful to think about addiction as a moral problem? A lot of the data says no, but it's tricky. I'll tell you why that is in a minute. So here's an interesting study talking about language and our understanding of ourselves. People who read a neuroscience-based explanation or were educated in neuroscience, that's everybody here now, found transgressors less blameworthy and were less punitive. I think they showed this to judges. So if I talk about the brain, judges are less likely to be punitive. But then, here's another study where I take people with depression, I give them a cheek swab, and it's bogus, and I say you have a serotonin deficiency. And if I said that your depression was from a serotonin deficiency, you were less optimistic about recovery, less confident in your ability to regulate negative moods, and you were more likely to value medication. And it encouraged a passive approach to treatment. So there is a downside to what I'm saying. If I say, you know, your addiction's a chemical problem, we need some chemicals to fix it, it's just a brain problem. And you then take a passive approach to treatment and just want your chemistry adjusted, that's not going to work well. So that is not what I'm saying, that this is just a brain disorder that's solved by biology, chemical biology. And also clinicians who had biologic models had less empathy for their patients. That's why I keep in mind that you're a guy with a kid and family and love and goals and all this stuff. Because if I just think, your serotonin is imbalanced, let me check the level and adjust it, I won't have the empathy for you that's critical for treatment. So the brain disease model, because this is where you get, if you have a absurd kind of pornographic brain-based model, is there's a chemical solution for this complex disorder. This is a Viagra dispenser. There's not an easy chemical solution for the problem of addiction, but there are chemistries that certainly help a lot. So the benefits of a brain disease model of addiction: A, people seek treatment more. That's nice. There's less stigma. There's less, people go to prison less. We've seen that change in society. It's the foundation for the medical model. If it's not a brain disorder, why would I give you a chemical that's going to change the way your brain works? It's got to be. Less focus on the morality and judgment and hellfire and all that good stuff. And there's less focus on willpower, which is good because, you know, willpower is a brain thing. But there's downsides to the brain disease model. It can be disempowering if you don't feel like you have personal control. You can focus on medical treatment, and we see that all the time. Adjust my meds and I'll be well. It posits that addiction is incurable and untreatable. I don't know that it's curable, but it certainly is treatable. And people who endorse this model take less responsibility. So I'm not saying that this brain model is like the Holy Grail and go in peace. I'm saying this is a coherent, rational, scientific model, but there are some downsides. Because ultimately, the brain is this very complex, multicolored place. The brain disease model of addiction is not a black or white thing. It encompasses a huge amount of different concepts, which I just hit you like with a fire hose. The 7 tools that I talked about in terms of understanding how the brain works. So we talked about one hand clapping, which is that all our thoughts and feelings come from the brain. If you have any debates about that, please see me. I don't think that's a statement that needs much expansion. We talked about levels from the gene to circuits to the single person to society. That's a way to think about the brain. The iceberg says that a lot of the stuff that goes on in here we're not aware of. There's modules and circuits, dopamine, opiates, stress, and reward. And then plastic and static. You can change your brain with learning and things, but then things like child abuse can scar the brain. I talked about the fact that I think about you like a dog sometimes because we're a very social species. And then there's this uniqueness in us that needs explanation. And lastly, that language matters and that the way you talk about a disorder with people and the way you talk about people with a disorder changes things in an important way. This is to remind me that this guy's playing tennis at 12:45, and that's why I'm going to entertain questions and then take my leave of you. But he's one of my addictions, so I don't get all choked up and teary because he's a great, one of my blessings in life. Let me see if there's any questions. Am I aware of any brain effects of some of the somatic therapies, like EMDR and what else?
Brain spotting.
Brain spotting I don't know about, but you could describe it. But here's what it comes down to. That's why this model actually is a nice backstop for me. Effective therapy changes the brain. If there's a therapy that changes the brain, it must have an impact on a brain disorder like addiction. What's the extent of the impact and how would that play out and blah, 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 blah. But there's no way around that idea. So that's the science of it. And what you'd have to do, you'd have to design an experiment and see. It wouldn't surprise me if in a certain population, if EMDR didn't help them manage their substance use disorders better. Wouldn't surprise me at all. Because I think EMDR is recognized as an effective therapy, which means it changes the brain. And if you've got awful memories burbling up from your unconscious, I got to imagine that's not real productive for recovery. Any other questions? Please don't misquote me. TMS is not prime time for addiction. I'm trying to give you a little glance into the future. TMS is as different from ECT as touching one of those old square batteries. Remember those back in the day when we had batteries? Is from getting defibrillated. The energy in ECT is tremendous. TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, is just a technique. You saw remember the coil? Where we use magnetism to change the electricity in your brain. So they both deal with electricity, but when getting TMS is like getting your hair cut. You're awake, you're alert, you go in, you leave. It's a non-event. ECT requires sedation, and it's a powerful but very different treatment. But they both deal with the brain as an electrical organ, because the brain's an electrical organ. You get struck by lightning, your brain is going to have a response to that. And there are a lot of new and growing therapies that get into the brain through electricity. So you can put an electrode here and put electrodes here, and keep your eyes on it. It's up and coming, but we need research. I find that most people have a vastly primitive understanding of the way the brain works and what that means for behavior and things. I just find that, every person I talk to just has tremendous, now that's not casting aspersions on anybody or anything, but I think if you really drilled down and help people think and introspect, teaching people what we already know would be fantastic. You know how long after hand washing was discovered to reduce infections it got implemented? It was like decades. So we didn't need more ideas about hand washing science. We need people to start washing their hands. Then aside from that, I don't know. There's a lot of exciting stuff. Well, again, to be very honest, teaching, because we're going to do an experiment in California where we're going to make a drug that can clearly cause addiction much more available, and we'll see how the neuroscience of that plays out. So we know a lot already. And when people have a broken model of what real substance use disorders actually are, I find that to be the most. So, but let me let that percolate, and I'll see if I come up with something really sexier than that.